How's it going, everybody? In this video, I'm going to go ahead and cover a data center virtualization overview. We're going to talk about what is data center virtualization and take a look at the topology that we've been looking at this far to understand really what it is that we're going to be diving into as we dive deeper into the data center virtualization architecture and all the cool components and capabilities that go into play in a DCV solution. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this comes into play, shall we? So just as a quick update, for those of you that watched me deploy the networking in the previous video and get the DC server, so the domain controller deployed, at the end of the deployment, the hard drives here that we went through and deployed, you'll notice now that they are showing up with a bunch of hard drives have been written to. So this is an example of thin provisioning, where you write to the disk as they need to be written, and then the rest of the disk are not utilized. So I wanted to show you that real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up our topology. I'm going to go and do a session here. We're going to go up here, and I'm going to go ahead and pull out the whiteboard, and I'm going to do a little bit of whiteboard here. I'm going to change the thickness to be medium, and I'm going to change this to be white. All right, so let me go ahead and move this to here so we can talk a little bit about how this all works, okay? So there's a few things that we need to get out of the gate and understand so that we know what we're diving into. Okay, so first and foremost, let's start from the bottom and work our way up in terms of some of the things that you're going to need. If you're going to lab this stuff up, you're going to need a server that has the ability to do the virtualization. First and foremost, can you deploy this inside of your laptop or your desktop PC? Yeah, you can do it, but it's going to be a bear to pull it off if you don't have the right resources. I highly recommend to anybody that's wanting to start playing with VMware that you get a PC or a laptop or a server that has the ability to do that. I'm providing you all the details of the server that I'm running to help you understand what's needed as we're moving through this. I'm going to be using VMware Workstation because it helps simplify the deployment. Not everybody has the resources or the capabilities of deploying servers in their lab, so VMware Workstation works really, really great to do that. So you deploy an operating system to your server, and then you deploy Workstation Pro on top of it to get everything working the way that you need it to. You deploy Workstation 16 Pro. That provides you a place to deploy your VMs and all that good stuff. So once you have those bits in place and you have your infrastructure, or you have your means or whatever, your base operating system, you have the platforms available to play with this stuff, then you move to the next step, which is going through and setting up the networking. The networking down here needs to be really laid out, and just so everybody understands that whatever lines you see drawn right here, between here and here, as well as up here and here, it's all the same networking, right? So this yellow line right here is the same yellow line that you see down here, so on and so forth. So just so you're aware of how that comes into play. So it's all the same virtual networking and things like that, so that we can provide the capabilities that we need to. So we have VM nets to do all the different whiz-bang wow features that come on a data center virtualization solution. Then you have the virtual machine itself. So this is going to be a VM virtual machine that you're going to deploy, and you're going to install Esxi onto it. Now, Esxi is the hypervisor. Hypervisors, so there's a couple different ways that you can look at this. You have the hypervisor is going to provide the virtualization. It is what's going to take your operating system and allow it to be deployed as a software PC or software server inside of Esxi, and Esxi is going to take all of the capabilities of that server, the networking, the storage, the CPU, all that stuff. It's going to take all those things that are needed to deploy a network and deploy a PC and make them work. So just so everybody's aware of it, you have CPU, you have RAM, you have storage, and then you have your network. You take these four components, you bundle them together and you map them to a software container, which is going to be your virtual machine. Okay? Now, the Esxi host has the means and the capability of doing this because it's when you install Esxi, again, just to recap this, is the hypervisor. It provides the virtualization capability. What is virtualization also known as? Abstraction. So you are, from abstraction, what that basically is synonymous with is portraying. It's abstraction. It's an interpretation of something. So you're portraying hardware resources as software resources. So you're taking all the physical capabilities that are physically plugged into the server, the total capacity, the sum of all the working parts, instead of presenting all of the capabilities, the 24 CPUs, 128 gigs of RAM, the 2 terabytes of storage, instead of taking all that and mapping it to one VM, which you could do that, honestly, you could. Instead of doing that with one VM, you take it and you can deploy many VMs. So let's say, for instance, you need to deploy 20 VMs. Could I deploy 20 VMs with the resources given here? 100% you could. So you could associate one CPU per host, or one CPU per VM. You could take 128 gigs of RAM and divide that by 20, figure out how many gigs of RAM you can use per VM. And you could take, of the 2 terabytes of storage, you can take 2 terabytes of storage and divide that by 20 and figure out how big of a hard drive you can associate. So it's a very simple math, can get you to the answers that you need. Now, with all that in play, you can take the software resources, associate them to the VMs on a per VM basis. Once you have that deployed, you can start deploying your VMs. Well, you can deploy an OS, you can install applications on top of that operating system inside that virtual machine. And these guys right here, this VM right here and this VM right here, are completely and 100% separate instances of each other. So I could deploy Linux over here and Windows on this guy, and they're completely oblivious to the fact that they're on the same network or in the same Esxi host. And that's the whole purpose of this, is to provide a segmentation of capability. So this guy here and this guy here, they don't know they exist unless you do something in the networking that allows them to know each other exists. And we'll talk about that more in detail when we get to virtual standard switches and distributed switches. And it gets even more interesting when you dive into VMware NSX, whether it's NSX-V for vSphere or T for, they kind of use the term transformers, which gives you more capabilities, bare metal, KVM, that type of stuff. But that's really where this comes into play. Now, in addition to that, we have our Esxi host, right? How do we manage the host? What do? We deployed Esxi, we gave it an IP address, and it's on the network. But how do we manage it? So remember, Esxi is the hypervisor that provides the virtualization, which is, again, an abstraction or an interpretation or a interpretation. What's the other word that I was using a moment ago? I forgot what I was using. Or portraying. You're taking the hardware resources, the CPU, RAM, storage, and the networking, associating that to a virtual machine, but you're basically taking these physical resources and you're associating them to software, right? You're converting them over. But how do you manage all of that? Well, on your PC, you're going to use a thing known as vSphere. Let me make that a lowercase h, just so that it's easier to... vSphere. What is vSphere? vSphere, or virtual sphere, depending on how you want to look at it, is the management. So vSphere is used to manage your Esxi hosts, right? So you can have your admin PC open up a web browser and point to the IP addresses of .22, .23, and .24, each in a separate tab inside of, say, Firefox or Chrome or whatever it is your browser you choose to use, and you can deploy that. Well, you can then log into your Esxi host and then deploy VM. So you can deploy a virtual machine, install an application on it, and everybody's happy, right? Gets the job done. But that's kind of a limiting factor, right? You don't get a lot of capabilities, and you're dealing with, at this point in time, on-box storage. So whatever is physically installed in that server is what you're going to be able to use. So it's kind of limiting, right? It doesn't give you a lot of flexibility in terms of operations. So what do you do in order to change that? What can you do? Well, if you want to take and be able to, move a virtual machine from one host to another. Let's say you don't have Vcenter deployed yet, right? Vcenter isn't rolled out, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. Vcenter's been removed from the equation. Well, you can deploy a storage area network or a SAN, and this guy right here will be I'll put in here an angle, it'll be iSCSI target, which is going to be the producer or the presenter of a storage solution. And what will end up happening is you'll take this hard drive, which will be a 750 gig hard drive. We'll be able to take that 750 gigs and then advertise it to the rest of the network so that host 1, host 2, and host 3 will all be able to access it. There's a couple things that need to be in place for this to work. We'll need to create what they call a VM kernel adapter. And what that does is it's given an IP address and associated to the logical switch or the virtual switch that ties into the storage. Then we create an iSCSI communication. So we configure an iSCSI software adapter. And we map that to the VM kernel adapter. The VM kernel adapter associates to the VM NIC that's attached to the virtual switch right here. And what ends up happening is the iSCSI adapter will be what they call a network port binding to the VM kernel adapter. And the VM kernel adapter is associated to a vSwitch that's attached to a VM NIC to allow its communication out to the network. And so what ends up happening is this server will go out and talk to this guy right here, and then you'll have storage going back and forth. So you'll be able to send SCSI reads and writes over an IP-enabled network, which is really, really cool when you break it down. So you'll be able to take that information, and then you'll be able to do the same thing on this host, and this host. And you'll be able to do what they call shared storage. Pretty cool stuff. Now, this is commonly referred to up here as a SAN, but it could also be what they call a JBOD, just a bunch of disks, things like that. It's just a big computer with lots and lots of hard drives stuffed in it, and given internet access and connection to the network, all that fun, happy stuff. Now, once we're at that point, there's a couple of additional things that we need to take into consideration here, because a lot of things are going on, right? Do you really want to be on the admin PC and do you really want to have 3 different tabs open to manage host 1, host 2, and host 3? I sure hope not. So what you can do instead is you can use this thing known as Vcenter. Now, Vcenter is something that is really going to unlock all of the whiz-bang wow features of Esxi. So I'm actually going to go clear the screen. So you have Vcenter. Vcenter is deployed, and we're going to be deploying Vcenter Server 6.7 Update 1. We're going to deploy that, and what we're going to do is we're going to go in and add .22, .23, and .24 to Vcenter, right? So they're all going to be added here. You go into Vcenter and you actually add the hosts individually. That's how that works. But when you add the host to Vcenter, that gives you all the cool features get unlocked, because you can't do them from vSphere, right? That's not a feature that's supported here. You manage your Esxi environment from Vcenter server. So instead of connecting into vSphere on here, or on here, right? You don't do that. What you do instead, and you don't even use vSphere, you open up, say, Chrome or Firefox, that was a horrible, there we go, or Firefox, and you open up a connection to Vcenter. You open a connection to Vcenter on .26. You're on here, or we're going to have AD or DNS enabled, which will point us to vcsa1.lab.local, and that'll be tied to the IP address of 10.255.1.26, and we'll be able to connect into the Vcenter server via DNS. We'll be able to pull it up, and then we'll be able to manage our Esxi hosts from Vcenter. That'll give us a lot of capabilities that we don't already have, because Vcenter server can do all the things that vSphere can do on a per host basis, but you can manage all three of your hosts at the same time. So we're going to go through and we're going to deploy we're going to migrate our Esxi hosts from a virtual standard switch on a per host basis over to a virtual distributed switch. And what exactly is a VDS? A VDS is a vCenter only capability. It's an object. And what you do with that is you create the virtual distributed switch. So first thing is you create VDS, and then you add VDS port groups. Think vSphere standard switch port groups, but they're attached to the distributed switch. And then what you do is you add hosts to the distributed switch. Add hosts, and then you migrate from, I'll put MIG for migrate, from VSS over to VDS. And when you do that is you're migrating from the standard switches on the Esxi host over to the distributed switch. So you migrate all of your networking and all this stuff right here on a per host basis over to the distributed switch. For every VM kernel adapter you have deployed for doing the storage, doing the vMotion, doing the fault tolerance, doing the Vsan, and all that type of stuff, you migrate them from VSS over to VDS. And that's really where you can start to deploy more and more advanced networking. So if I add an additional Esxi host, for example, I can go ahead and then add a new host, and then any port groups that I create on the VDS for that particular vCenter, because you can have multiple virtual distributed switches. You don't have to have just one. You can have multiple of them deployed. You can deploy multiple VDSs, and then what you end up doing is you create port groups, and for every port group that you create in the VDS, it gets deployed to the individual hosts, like so. And then what you're able to do is, that pushes the information down to the Esxi host, and then from there, you're able to move a VM's vNIC into that particular network in order for it to communicate the way that it needs to. Now, that's part of the process here, right? So the next step would be to add in some more advanced features like this guy right here, this cluster. A cluster allows you to, or clustering basically, in a simple sense, enables a couple different features. The first one is going to be, I'll say, resource aggregation. What exactly does that mean? Resource aggregation. You're going to be able to take the CPU, the RAM, the storage, I'm going to put SAN here for short, and then the NIC. You're able to take all of these capabilities, aggregate them together, and it'll show up as a aggregate or a sum of all the working parts. Now, some of these things will not be able to be looked at like an aggregate. These three will. CPU, RAM, and storage will show up out of the gate. NIC or networking, you really can't aggregate them, but you can basically mimic on a per host basis how many NICs you associate, and then you can dictate how much networking there's going to be based off of that, how many network adapters you have installed. Clustering also enables a bunch of other stuff. So we're going to be able to deploy HA, or for high availability, we'll be able to add in DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler. Think of DRS as a queuing system, where if this VM is powered off, and this, well, I'm going to put it here, I'll put an X, and this VM is powered on, right? That's going to be my on sign. If that's the case, then if I have DRS enabled, then I say I turn on this guy on here and then this guy on here. What will end up happening is DRS will look at the load of all of the Esxi hosts that are in a cluster and will try to move the VMs to where they have to go based off the load in the cluster. And there's a number of ways that you can deploy this. A lot of people like to do what they call a fully automated solution, to where they don't want to worry about the details. If they power on a VM or a VM powers down or is not needed or whatever, then they'll be able to move the VMs between the Esxi hosts as they need to. Now your question might be, well, how do they get moved? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where a vMotion comes into play. Well, what is vMotion? vMotion is known as migration. A migration is moving a VM from one physical host over to another physical host. The cool thing about that is it can be done while the VM is powered on. So you don't have to power down all the VMs on a particular host in order to do management on it. You can actually move all the VMs on that host to another host and then take that host down, do whatever maintenance you might have to do, so on and so forth. But it gives you that flexibility. So when it comes to HA, there's a couple different ways that you can do this. You can do the regular HA, which is if a physical host fails, right? Then you can take all the VMs that were on that host, evacuate them to this host, and then power them back on. That's what they refer to as, that's one variation of HA. Then you have the other option of HA, which is fault tolerance. Fault tolerance will say, okay, I'm going to make this guy, he's super critical. He needs to be on and powered, ready to go at a moment's notice. So you'll make this guy over here will be doing the exact same thing, right? And what you do is you enable fault tolerance on a VM, and then you make this guy here the primary, and you make this guy here the secondary. Whatever happens on this guy is replicated from that host across the network up to this guy right here. Everything you do, including like if you're moving the mouse, for example, or you're creating a file, or you're doing something on this server or this VM, everything that's happening will automatically be replicated over to this VM in real time. So if this VM dies, this VM goes live for it out of the gate. Makes it very, very easy to work with and makes it very, very cool to operate. That's some of the capabilities we're going to go out and deploy as well. We'll take a look at all the HA capabilities that are out there, but that's really the high-level details. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be Vsan, or Virtual Storage Area Network. Now, Vsan is actually kind of a newer capability that just came out in the past couple of releases. I think 5.5 is the first time I remember hearing about it. So let's say, for example, you don't have a storage area network that you can deploy. Whether it's not available, can't afford it, insert whatever reason you want. I don't really care, to be honest with you. But you have a terabyte of storage here, a terabyte of storage here, and you have a terabyte of storage here. But this guy is using 10% of this. This guy's using 5%. This guy's using 22%, right? So out of the whole thing, you're using a whopping 35% of the total storage between the Esxi hosts. But we also have SSDs installed in each one of the hosts, right? And let's say for the example that this is 1 terabyte. So we have 1 terabyte here, you have 1 terabyte here, and you have 1 terabyte here. Well, Vsan requires that you have flash enabled, or flash storage enabled. In other words, just installed. This could be a SSD, which is typically what we're talking about. You can have your SSD physically installed inside your server, and you have your flash storage, and then you have your archive. And what they refer to this is a hybrid solution. What you will be able to do inside of Vcenter is you'll be able to mark a particular type of storage, flash versus spinning disk. So we'll actually mark a device as a flash device, and then we'll add that to the deployment to deploy a Vsan. It's actually very, very easy to do. We'll do that, and what will end up happening is when we add Vsan to a cluster of 3 Esxi hosts, we'll actually be able to provide that in a virtual storage area network. So we'll be able to take the storage that's physically associated with each Esxi host, virtualize it, and then be able to distribute it among the 3 Esxi hosts. Very, very cool stuff. Vsan is really, really cool. It doesn't require a license like it used to. You can just turn the capability on, configure it the way that it needs to be done, and all that good stuff that goes along with that. That's Vsan. The next thing we're going to talk about is storage enhancements. So there's a couple of different ones we can take a look at. There is the storage-based policy management, where you can dictate how storage is leveraged in the environment. You can do a one-tier storage solution where all the storage data stores are utilized as the same level, so there's no preference between flash and physical on-disk storage or on-box storage, and then iSCSI or storage area network connectivity. You can do a tiered, so a 2-tier, like you have flash as the primary, and then you have archival status in the background here. You can do a 3-tier if you want, where you do, flash is the first one. Then maybe you have a high-speed on-box spinning disk that could be at level 2, and then maybe you have iSCSI. Whatever way you want to look at it, you can play around with storage-based policy management that way, and you can basically associate a group of VMs to a particular storage solution, and then play around with those capabilities as well. That's also going to tie what they call storage I/O control, where storage I/O control is basically at the hard drive level. You can basically, I'm just going to put down hard drive, or actually let me put in data store, would be a better way of referring to it, data store, where you can go in there and you can go on a per storage solution basis, and you can basically dictate how many shares of that particular storage you're going to associate and that type of stuff. We'll talk about SIOC in more detail later. Then you also have network IOC, network I/O control, which is basically going to be quality of service. So you can dictate how a device is used in the network and polarized, and because out of the gate everybody gets the same amount of resources. We'll talk about that more in detail later as well. And that's really the kit and caboodle, the difference. So once we get through all of that and we have all those capabilities deployed, we're going to take a look at some administrative stuff like, how do you integrate Active Directory as a identity management solution, things like that. Then we're going to deploy Vcenter 2. Vcenter 2 is going to allow us to deploy a second Vcenter. We're going to deploy through, and when we deploy Vcenter 1, we're going to go through the GUI install, which is going to be the clickety-click stuff. We're going to deploy Vcenter 2. The first one we do is going to be to an Esxi host. So we're going to deploy it to this guy right here, and we're going to use the CLI to do it, to do basically a unattended deployment. So I'm going to walk you through how that will work. We're going to deploy all the capabilities we need to. We're going to deploy with a CLI version, will be in non-SSO mode, which means that Vcenter 2 and Vcenter 1 will not join the same single sign-on domain. So that means, because I've tested this out a few times and I have not been able to find a clean way to deploy a second Vcenter server instance to an existing Vcenter server instance without doing it through the GUI. I have to use the GUI in order for that to work. We'll take a look at how to deploy via the CLI, deploy a Vcenter server, get it operational, but then we're just going to blow it away, just so we can see the process. Then we're going to deploy via the GUI again, but for SSO. And we're going to do this via the GUI. We're going to join an existing SSO domain, single sign-on, that will allow me to log into Vcenter 1 and see Vcenter 2 inside of Vcenter 1. And then the same thing, if we were to log into Vcenter 2, you'll see Vcenter 1 inside of its outputs and the way that it looks. Then we're going to be able to deploy additional Esxi hosts, additional VMs on those Esxi hosts, and go through all those details. I'm going to give enough of the VMs, or these Esxi hosts down here, enough resources so that I can deploy what they call Vcenter HA, or high availability, where we're going to be able to deploy Vcenter high availability on each one of the Esxi hosts so we can see exactly how that plays out and provide the HA capabilities for that. Then we're going to take a look at Esxi Auto Deploy. Auto Deploy allows you to basically deploy an Esxi host by powering it on. It grabs an IP address from the network. It calls home to figure out what's going on. There's some information in the DHCP scope that we use to tell the Esxi host which TFTP server to download its ISO file from. It'll boot over the network using a thing known as PXE, the pre-execution environment boot capability, which means you can install an operating system over the network. It's pretty cool what you can pull off with this stuff nowadays and deploy all that and see exactly how it comes together. So these are some of the details that we're going to go through and play around with as we're moving forward. So that's at the end of the day, that is what we're going to be doing as we progress through this. We're going to be playing around with a lot of individual features and capabilities. Then we're going to get into some of the more administrative pieces that we need to, and understand how all that stuff comes together and stuff like that. We'll then be able to take whatever environment we have, and if we want to deploy something like NSX or desktop mobility, or also known as DTM, we'll be able to deploy this on deploy those solutions on this deployment in this environment and go through all those details as well if we'd like. Those are going to be separate videos, but I wanted you guys to see exactly how we're going to deploy all this stuff in detail so you would have a really good idea and understanding of how data center virtualization comes into play. I want to thank you guys for hanging out with me in this video, and until next time, guys, take it easy.